March 1918. The First World War is raging across Europe. America has been at war for almost a year, but the fighting still feels distant to most citizens on the eastern seaboard. Troop convoys sail constantly from New York, Norfolk, and Baltimore, carrying men and supplies across the submarine-infested Atlantic. War posters demand sacrifice, patience, and vigilance. The war machine consumes steel, coal, and manganese ore in staggering amounts. Every shipment is crucial.
Among the vessels pressed into this enormous effort is USS Cyclops, a Navy collier built in 1910. She is a steel giant of her era, measuring 542 feet long, capable of carrying more than 10,000 tons of coal or ore. The Cyclops was designed to keep the Navy's coal-hungry fleet fueled across the oceans. But in 1918, she carried something more valuable than coal: manganese ore, critical for producing high-grade steel used in weapons, armor, and ships.
On March 3, 1918, Cyclops lies anchored in the harbor of Bridgetown, Barbados. The island is a vital coaling station for Allied ships crossing from South America toward the United States. The tropical sun burns on her steel decks. Dock workers sweat as they finish loading manganese ore that has traveled north from Brazilian mines. Cranes creak, chains rattle, and ore dust clings to the humid air. 306 men are aboard: officers, enlisted sailors, and a handful of passengers. Some walk ashore for their final hours of liberty, buying fruit, writing letters, or simply stretching their legs after weeks at sea. Others stay aboard, tending machinery or standing watch. Few suspect that this day will be their last glimpse of land.
The Cyclops has sailed thousands of miles before. She has crossed from the Pacific to the Atlantic. She has supplied the fleet during the war. There is no reason to believe this voyage will be any different. Her orders are straightforward: depart Barbados, steam north to Baltimore, deliver her cargo of manganese ore, then prepare for further duty.
Yet whispers follow the ship. Her captain, George W. Worley, is a controversial figure. German-born, naturalized American, he is a strict disciplinarian, often resented by crew. Some sailors consider him eccentric, even unstable. But he has held command of Cyclops for years, and the Navy trusts him with this mission. War has no patience for personal disputes.
On March 4th, the final preparations are made. The last cranes are secured, hatches closed, lines cast off. The collier's funnels belch smoke as her engines churn to life. Slowly, she eases from the harbor and turns north into the Caribbean. The voyage has begun.
To the people left behind, nothing seems unusual. Ships depart Barbados every week. Yet within days, the Cyclops will vanish. No distress call, no debris, no survivor. In time, she will be remembered as one of America's greatest maritime mysteries.
The story of Cycloponus begins not with her disappearance, but with the world that built her. To understand why her loss mattered so much, one must return to the early years of the 20th century, when steel and coal ruled navies and empires.
The early 1900s were defined by industrial might. Coal-powered ships, trains, and factories, steel-built bridges, skyscrapers, and battleships. Control of these resources meant global influence. The United States, rising as an industrial giant, invested heavily in a modern navy. President Theodore Roosevelt's Great White Fleet had circled the globe in 1907, proving America's arrival as a maritime power. To sustain this fleet, the Navy built colliers, specialized ships to transport coal to warships at sea. Without colliers, battleships could not operate far from home ports. USS Cyclops, launched in Philadelphia in 1910, was one of the largest of these. Her broad holds could swallow thousands of tons of fuel. She was not glamorous like a battleship or swift like a cruiser, but she was essential. The Cyclops served across the Atlantic and Caribbean. When war broke out in 1914, she continued routine service, supplying coal to the fleet and carrying cargoes of ore. After America entered the war in 1917, her role became critical. Every ton of manganese ore she carried went into the furnaces that forged guns, armor plate, and helmets for soldiers in France. By early 1918, the Allies faced a desperate struggle. German U-boats threatened supply lines. Russia had collapsed, freeing German divisions for the Western Front. The United States rushed men and material across the ocean. The Cyclops' mission was part of this surge. Her cargo of manganese from Brazil was destined for steel mills in Baltimore. There, it would be transformed into weapons for the battlefield.
The ship was a floating world of its own.
Officers lived in cabins along the upper decks, with mess rooms and offices. Enlisted sailors slept in hammocks strung in long compartments, the air thick with coal dust and oil fumes. The daily routine was strict. Watches rotated every 4 hours, meals served in narrow mess lines, maintenance carried out endlessly. The boilers demanded constant feeding of coal. The ore cargo had to be checked to ensure it did not shift. Despite hardships, sailors found ways to pass time. Some played cards, others wrote letters. A few played instruments, filling the evenings with music. The war loomed in the distance, but in the Caribbean, the sea was calm and the days were warm. For many young sailors, this voyage seemed far safer than the trenches of France. Passengers aboard added a civilian element. Some were Americans returning home from Brazil. Others were specialists connected to the ore trade. They shared the cramped conditions, but most accepted it as the price of wartime travel. Captain Worley commanded with a stern hand. Accounts from those who knew him describe a man who rarely smiled, who demanded strict obedience, and who punished harshly. Some sailors disliked him deeply, yet discipline on a naval ship was non-negotiable. Complaints remained whispers. No one imagined these tensions would later feed rumors about sabotage or betrayal.
March 4th, 1918. Dawn breaks over Bridgetown Harbor. The Cyclops' engines rumbled to life. Her bow points north, toward a long journey through the Caribbean, past the Bahamas, then up the U.S. coast to Baltimore. On shore, a few dock workers wave. Some wives and girlfriends of sailors watch from the pier, wiping sweat and dust from their faces, unaware it will be the last time they see their loved ones. The collier disappears into the horizon, a black plume trailing behind. She carries 10,000 tons of manganese, 306 souls, and the weight of expectation from a nation at war. In the days ahead, no one will hear from her again. The disappearance of Cyclops would become more than a naval loss. It would become legend, a story told in whispers of cursed seas and haunted triangles. But in 1918, it was a raw tragedy. Families waited for letters that never came. The Navy launched searches that found nothing. And historians, a century later, still cannot say for certain what happened. The hook of this mystery is brutal in its simplicity. How can a massive steel ship, fully crewed, vanish without leaving a single clue? To answer, we must trace every step of the voyage, study every man aboard, and follow the desperate search that consumed the Navy. Only then can we understand why the Cyclops remains one of the most haunting maritime mysteries in American history. The departure of USS Cyclops was routine in appearance, yet within days the absence of her signal would ignite one of the greatest mysteries in American naval history. Before diving into the search, it is worth pausing to understand the wider frame of her mission, the tension of the times, and the human lives that filled her steel hull.
By early 1918, the United States had thrown its industrial weight behind the Allied cause. Troop ships left New York almost weekly, escorted by destroyers against the ever-present threat of German U-boats. Factories worked around the clock to produce rifles, machine guns, helmets, uniforms, and artillery shells. Every train that clattered across the continent carried supplies destined for the Atlantic. Manganese ore was a critical component. Mixed with iron, it hardened steel. Without it, American industry could not produce the quantities of durable weapons and armor the war demanded. Brazil had become a major supplier of this ore. The Cyclops' voyage from Rio de Janeiro, then through Bahia and Barbados, was part of a vital pipeline. Her holds were filled with black rock that, once smelted, would harden the steel used to make warships, rails, and munitions. For the men aboard, however, the cargo was just weight. What mattered were the routines of shipboard life, the long watches, the relentless work of maintaining a vessel far from home.
Each morning aboard Cyclops began before sunrise. The shrill call of the bosun's pipe roused the men from hammocks. The air below decks was heavy, mixed with the smell of coal dust, sweat, and oil. Breakfast might consist of coffee, hard bread, and a few rashers of bacon. Then came the day's assignments: chipping rust, greasing machinery, checking the hatches, keeping the giant cargo steady. The ore dust seeped into everything. Sailors wiped it from their skin and clothing, only to find it there again hours later. Yet many accepted the hardship with stoic humor. Letters home often joked about the black snow that followed them. Officers kept to their charts, calculating positions, measuring speed, and checking for currents. Radio operators manned their stations, tapping messages in Morse code to shore stations or nearby vessels. But after March 4, no message from Cyclops would ever reach another ship or port. Leisure came in small doses: card games on the mess tables, harmonica tunes, rough boxing matches on the deck, or simply leaning against the rail, staring at the endless sea. Some men wrote letters they hoped to post upon arrival in Baltimore. Many never reached their intended recipients.
At the center of the ship's story stands her captain. Born Johann Friedrich Wichmann in Germany, he immigrated to the United States in the 1870s, later changing his name to George Worley. He became a naturalized citizen and eventually joined the Navy, where his long experience at sea earned him command positions. Accounts of Worley vary sharply. Some described him as competent and reliable, a man who knew his ship. Others painted him as harsh, even tyrannical. He was said to walk the deck in a sailor's cap and pajamas, armed with a revolver. Some stories claim he berated officers in front of crew, that he distrusted subordinates, and that morale aboard Cyclops often suffered. In wartime America, his German origins drew suspicion. Rumors swirled that he harbored sympathies for the Kaiser. Nothing was ever proven, but later speculation about the ship's fate often returned to Worley's character. Was he a stern but loyal commander, or something more dangerous? When Cyclops sailed from Barbados, Worley gave no hint of unusual plans. His destination was Baltimore. His orders were routine. Yet the uncertainty around his leadership would fuel theories for decades to come.
Witnesses in Barbados confirmed Cyclops left harbor on March 4. The weather was clear, seas calm. Dock officials watched her silhouette shrink against the horizon, trailing a plume of black smoke. No one could have guessed they were watching the last verifiable sighting of the vessel. There were no distress calls, no intercepted radio messages. The Atlantic swallowed her in silence. This fact is what makes the mystery so enduring. A steel ship of nearly 20,000 tons should leave evidence if it sank: timbers, lifeboats, bodies, or oil slicks. But none were ever found. Some commercial vessels later reported seeing a large collier in the Caribbean around those dates, but none could confirm it was Cyclops. Ship sighting records from wartime were notoriously unreliable. Crews often misidentified vessels, especially in poor light. The Navy treated these reports cautiously. The reality remains simple. After March 4, Cyclops vanished from human knowledge.
Back in the United States, word of the ship's absence spread slowly. At first, it was not unusual for vessels to run behind schedule. Radio communication at sea was far less reliable than it would become later. Families expected letters once a ship docked, not during voyages. By mid-March, however, concern mounted. The Navy privately acknowledged the ship was overdue. Families began to worry. Some wrote letters to newspapers asking for updates. Others waited outside telegraph offices, hoping for official word. The press soon caught on. Small notices in East Coast papers asked, "Where is USS Cyclops?" The story grew when it became clear the ship was not just late, but entirely unaccounted for. In wartime, secrecy was common, but the scale of the mystery was too large to hide.
Maritime disasters usually announce themselves: an explosion, a distress signal, wreckage washing ashore. Cyclops produced none of these. That absence is what made the story resonate. It suggested forces beyond the ordinary: sabotage, mutiny, enemy action, or something stranger. For the families, however, the silence was agony. They wanted answers, not speculation. Mothers clutched photographs of sons in uniform. Wives feared telegrams that never arrived. Children asked when their fathers would return. The uncertainty was crueler than death.
To understand the disappearance, one must picture the sea lanes of 1918. Cyclops' course from Barbados to Baltimore would have taken her through the eastern Caribbean, past Puerto Rico, then into the open Atlantic along the Bahamas and up toward the Chesapeake. These waters were heavily trafficked. Convoys, freighters, and warships steamed constantly along the same routes. That such a large ship could disappear in such a busy corridor baffled the Navy. In later years, this route would become famous as part of the so-called Bermuda Triangle, a region mythologized for vanishings. But in 1918, it was simply a critical lifeline for wartime shipping. If Cyclops sank suddenly, why had no other vessel seen or heard it? If she was attacked by a U-boat, why had no survivors been left adrift? The questions multiplied and answers were scarce.
America in 1918 was a land on edge. Espionage trials filled newspapers. German immigrants were often treated with suspicion. Propaganda warned citizens to watch for saboteurs and traitors. In this atmosphere, the loss of a massive ship under a German-born captain seemed ripe for rumor. Some claimed Worley had steered the ship toward enemy waters. Others whispered that German agents had sabotaged the cargo, turning the manganese ore into a hidden explosive. These claims had no proof, but in wartime, proof mattered less than fear. The Navy officially rejected such talk, but privately, officers debated possibilities. They had to. How else could such a disappearance be explained?
In the weeks after the ship's departure, families still clung to hope. Some believed Cyclops had diverted to another port. Others thought she might be repairing damage at sea, delayed but intact. But as March turned to April with no word, hope gave way to grief. The Navy prepared official statements. Newspapers readied headlines. The loss was about to shift from private worry to public tragedy. Before long, the entire country would know the name Cyclops, and the mystery of her fate would pass from naval report to cultural legend, a story retold for generations.
By late April 1918, silence from Cyclops could no longer be dismissed. The Navy had hoped for word, perhaps a delayed docking, perhaps an unexpected diversion. But every port inquiry returned the same answer: she had not arrived. Her name appeared on no manifests, her flag was seen by no lookouts. On April 14, the Navy formally declared USS Cyclops missing, cause unknown. A statement went out to newspapers across the country. It was short, factual, and offered no speculation. The ship was gone. All hands presumed lost. The wording was deliberate. To admit ignorance was rare for a military branch that prided itself on control and vigilance. Yet here, the Navy had no choice. No wreckage, no radio logs, no survivors.
The loss meant 306 souls vanished. Officers, sailors, and a few civilians aboard. In one stroke, it became the single largest non-combat loss of life in U.S. naval history. Entire towns felt the impact. In Baltimore, Philadelphia, and small farming communities, families waited for answers that never came. Memorial services were held without bodies. Photographs of young sailors in uniform were displayed in churches, draped with black cloth. Ministers preached on uncertainty, on the mystery of God's will, on the sea's power to swallow men whole. Wives received Navy telegrams that offered condolences, but no explanation. Parents placed framed portraits on mantels, lighting candles in memory of sons they would never bury. Children asked questions that no adult could answer.
In Washington, the incident sparked urgent debate. Senators demanded to know how a Navy vessel could disappear in home waters. The country was at war, and the public needed reassurance. Was the coast secure? Were U-boats operating closer to American shores than reported? Had the Navy concealed dangers from the public? Behind closed doors, officers admitted the scale of the mystery unsettled them. The Atlantic was dangerous, but it rarely erased ships so completely. Accidents usually left traces. Even torpedoed vessels left lifeboats and debris. Cyclops left nothing. Theories circulated within the Navy itself: structural failure, sabotage, mutiny, sudden storm. None could be proven. Investigators faced an uncomfortable truth. Without wreckage, evidence, or survivors, they had nothing to work with.
The most immediate suspicion fell on Germany. In 1918, U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking merchant ships and sometimes even naval auxiliaries. The possibility that a U-boat had ambushed Cyclops seemed plausible. But records captured after the war told another story. Germany's submarine fleet kept meticulous logs of sinkings, both for propaganda and for military tracking. None reported an encounter with a vessel matching Cyclops. Nor would such a success have been hidden. The destruction of a massive U.S. Navy collier would have been a propaganda victory for Germany. Silence suggested they had nothing to do with it. Still, to American families in 1918, the German threat loomed large. Many believed a U-boat had struck the ship and left no survivors. Rumors grew that perhaps the Germans had taken the crew prisoner, spiriting them away to camps. None of these rumors were true, but in the fog of war, they persisted.
Another possibility was the sea itself. Cyclops' route took her through the Atlantic's unpredictable corridors. Sudden squalls, rogue waves, or structural stresses could bring disaster. Some speculated the heavy cargo of manganese ore had shifted, capsizing the vessel. Yet weather records showed little unusual in early March 1918. Conditions were not calm, but neither were they catastrophic.
Dozens of ships crossed the same waters in those days without incident. If Cyclops had encountered a storm, why had no other ship reported it? Still, a sudden squall or a structural collapse beneath heavy load could sink a vessel quickly, perhaps too quickly for a distress call. The Navy investigated Cyclops' design and found her not without flaws. Her hull had shown signs of stress in earlier voyages. Loaded with dense ore, she might have succumbed to forces unseen.
No figure in the story attracted more suspicion than Captain Worley. His German birth and rumored temper made him an easy target. Some sailors who had served under him described his behavior as erratic. Allegations included verbal abuse, paranoia, even threats against subordinates. In wartime, when suspicion of German sympathizers was high, Worley's past looked damning. Theories suggested he had defected, steering the ship toward Germany. Others believed he might have staged a mutiny or been murdered by his own men. The Navy reviewed Worley's record. They found no evidence of disloyalty. He had served faithfully for decades, yet the rumors persisted, especially in newspapers eager for a sensational story. For families seeking answers, the idea of betrayal sometimes seemed easier to grasp than the idea of the sea swallowing a ship whole.
Decades later, popular culture would link Cyclops to the Bermuda Triangle, that stretch of Atlantic between Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico. Books and television shows claimed supernatural forces had claimed the ship, along with dozens of others. Some pointed to magnetic anomalies, time warps, or extraterrestrial intervention. In 1918, no such idea existed. To the Navy, the disappearance was a tragedy, not a mystery of the paranormal. The Bermuda Triangle legend would only grow in the 1950s and 60s, when writers searching for unexplained stories rediscovered Cyclops' fate. Today, separating fact from myth is essential. Cyclops disappeared, but in waters busy with traffic and without any recorded storm. That alone was strange enough. Adding supernatural speculation only distracted from the real human loss.
The Cyclops inquiry produced no definitive conclusion. The Navy issued a final report, cause unknown. That phrase would echo through history. Families had no grave to visit, no wreck to mourn over. In the years after the war, the loss faded from headlines, but never from memory. The Navy named other vessels in her class, but none carried the same shadow. Each time a collier steamed from port, some sailors remembered Cyclops. For decades, amateur historians and naval researchers revisited the case. They compared weather logs, shipping records, U-boat patrol maps. None could close the case. The wreck of Cyclops has never been found.
The story of USS Cyclops is not just about a ship. It is about the people aboard, about families left in limbo, about a nation grappling with the limits of its knowledge. It is about how mystery magnifies grief, and how unanswered questions linger longer than tragedies with clear causes. The men aboard Cyclops became symbols of sacrifice. Even though their deaths were not on a battlefield, they were victims of the sea, of circumstance, of forces still unclear. Their story has endured because it resists closure.
With the hook set, the question remains, what truly happened to USS Cyclops? Theories abound, some grounded in evidence, others in rumor or imagination. In the next section, we will break down each major possibility: structural failure, sabotage, weather, mutiny, and more, evaluating what makes sense and what does not. The truth may never be known, but by examining each theory carefully, we can narrow the field and understand why the ship's loss still haunts naval history.
Opening from mystery to hypotheses. When a ship vanishes without a trace, people search for answers. Some demand logic, others accept rumor. With USS Cyclops, the lack of wreckage created a vacuum. Into that vacuum poured theories: military, mechanical, natural, and conspiratorial. The Navy's official line was clear: cause unknown. But sailors, journalists, and families were not satisfied. They wanted explanations. Why did no distress call go out? Why was no wreckage found? Why did other ships crossing similar waters arrive safely? To get closer to the truth, we must examine each major theory in turn. Some are credible, some are not. Each reflects the anxieties of its time, whether fear of storms, mistrust of captains, or suspicion of foreign enemies.
Theory 1. Structural weakness.
The Cyclops was massive for her day, but mass alone does not guarantee safety. Like all ships, she depended on the integrity of her hull and internal frames. Naval records reveal Cyclops had shown signs of structural stress before her final voyage. On one earlier journey, she developed cracks in her deck and hull plates. Repairs were made, but questions lingered. A ship that large, carrying a heavy cargo like manganese ore, was vulnerable to strain. If the ore shifted suddenly, the load could compromise her balance. Experts in maritime engineering note that ore cargoes are tricky. Unlike coal or grain, manganese is dense and uneven. It can compact under its own weight, exerting enormous pressure on the hull. If loaded improperly, it could create a deadly imbalance. Imagine Cyclops in heavy seas. A wave strikes broadside. The oar shifts, pressing against bulkheads. A crack widens. Water rushes in. Within minutes, the ship could list fatally and sink. With no time for a distress call, the crew would be trapped. This theory explains the silence. It explains the absence of wreckage, since a hull collapse in deep water would scatter fragments too small to drift far. It aligns with what little the Navy knew, but it remains unproven because the wreck has never been located to confirm it.
Theory 2. A sudden storm. The Atlantic in March is unpredictable. Even when weather reports suggest calm seas, microsystems can form quickly. A sudden squall or a rogue wave could overwhelm even a sturdy vessel. Reports from nearby ships in early March 1918 noted no major storms, but absence of reports does not mean absence of weather. A localized storm could have struck Cyclops alone. Rogue waves, in particular, deserve mention. Mariners across centuries have described walls of water appearing without warning. For years, science dismissed these as exaggeration. But satellite data and oceanographic studies now confirm rogue waves do exist. They can rise over 80 feet, striking with massive force. A rogue wave hitting Cyclops broadside could roll her. Combined with a heavy ore cargo, recovery might have been impossible. If the ship capsized and went down quickly, radios might have been disabled at once, leaving no time for a call. This theory is plausible, but again, unproven. It relies on rare but possible events. Cyclops' loss fits the profile of ships struck by rogue waves, but the lack of evidence keeps it in the realm of speculation.
Theory 3. German U-boat attack. In 1918, America was at war. German U-boats stalked the Atlantic, sinking merchant ships and Navy vessels alike. Families of the Cyclops crew quickly embraced the idea that a U-boat had torpedoed her. It made sense emotionally. A wartime enemy provided a tangible villain. Better to believe in a German attack than in meaningless accident. But official naval archives from both sides tell a different story. The U.S. Navy never recorded distress calls or sightings of U-boats near Cyclops' route. After the war, captured German records revealed no submarine claimed the sinking. And had they sunk her, they would have publicized it. The propaganda value of destroying the U.S. Navy's largest collier would have been enormous. Could Germany have sunk her secretly? Theoretically, yes. But secrecy was not their style in 1918. They wanted the world to know the reach of their subs. The silence argues against this theory. Still, in the climate of wartime fear, the U-boat idea held power. Families clung to it because it gave them something to blame. In absence of proof, grief looks for targets. Theory 4. Sabotage or espionage. Another theory pointed inward. Sabotage. During World War I, fears of spies and traitors ran high. Captain Worley's German birth fueled suspicion. Some claimed he was secretly loyal to Germany, steering the ship into enemy hands. Others suggested a saboteur planted explosives aboard. The evidence is weak. Worley had served the U.S. faithfully for decades. He had his quirks, but no proof of treason. Nor did investigations uncover signs of sabotage in port. Cyclops left Barbados without incident, fully operational. But wartime paranoia is powerful. Newspapers of 1918 printed accusations without evidence. Some called Worley a traitor outright. Others claimed a German agent must have slipped aboard. Espionage as an explanation appeals to human psychology. It provides drama, motive, betrayal, but historically, nothing backs it up. No German records suggest an operation against Cyclops. No American inquiry found sabotage. The theory is compelling for storytelling, but thin on facts.
Theory 5. Mutiny. Among the darker rumors was mutiny. A Accounts of Captain Worley's harsh leadership circulated widely. Sailors described him as abusive, paranoid, even unfit for command. Could his crew have rebelled, seizing the ship and abandoning her? Theoretically, yes. Mutinies occurred in naval history. In times of stress, under poor leadership, crews have risen against captains. But mutiny leaves trails. If the crew had taken the ship, they would need a port, a plan, resources. None of that exists in the record. No sightings, no landings, no messages. A ship that large cannot hide. The mutiny theory thrives only in rumor. It speaks more to Worley's reputation than to evidence. A disliked captain makes mutiny imaginable, but imagination is not proof.
Theory 6. The Bermuda Triangle. Decades later, writers linked Cyclops to the so-called Bermuda Triangle. They claimed supernatural forces dragged her beneath the waves. Stories of compasses spinning, of magnetic fields, of alien abductions all grew around the case. But these ideas emerged in the 1950s and 60s, long after the fact. In 1918, no one spoke of the Bermuda Triangle. They spoke of storms, of sabotage, of U-boats, but never of paranormal zones. The Triangle legend is myth-making. It plays on real disappearances like Cyclops, but layers fantasy atop them. For families seeking truth, such theories are insult. They trivialize real loss. Scientifically, the waters where Cyclops vanished are no more dangerous than any other busy shipping lane. Thousands of vessels pass safely each year. The Triangle is a cultural invention, not an oceanic fact.
The U.S. Navy launched inquiries. They gathered reports from ports, examined weather logs, reviewed shipyard records. But every path ended in uncertainty. No distress call meant no timeline. No wreckage meant no evidence. No survivors meant no testimony. Each theory carried weight, but none could be proven. In the end, the Navy filed the loss as cause unknown. It was the only honest answer. Without wreckage, the truth lay beyond reach. But the human need for answers does not end there. Theories endured because families wanted closure. Historians kept searching because mysteries demand solving. Even today, with sonar and submersibles scanning the seafloor, Cyclops' final resting place remains hidden. Behind every theory lie human stories. Sons who never came home. Parents who read each new article, hoping for a lead. Sailors on other ships who crossed those waters, wondering if they too might vanish. Theories may seem abstract, but for the families, each one mattered. Each theory offered either comfort or despair. Believing in a German U-boat meant their loved ones died in war. Believing in storm or accident meant meaningless tragedy. Believing in sabotage or mutiny meant betrayal. That is why the Cyclops mystery endures. It is not just an engineering puzzle. It is a human wound, never healed.
Let's start with the manganese ore. It was the Cyclops' final cargo, and it may have been her undoing. Maritime experts consistently stress one fact: not all bulk cargo is created equal. Grain flows like water. Coal is dusty, but stable. Ore is dense, irregular, and capable of exerting massive localized pressure. Manganese ore in particular is unforgiving. A single cubic foot weighs over 100 pounds. When stacked deep in the ship's hold, the pressure is extreme. If improperly trimmed or distributed, the ore can shift under stress. When seas get rough, the sudden movement of several thousand tons can become catastrophic. There are recorded cases of other ships sinking from similar cargo shifts. One infamous incident involved the Derbyshire, a bulk carrier lost in 1980 in the Pacific. Though far larger and more modern than Cyclops, it too was torn apart by stresses, amplified by its heavy ore load. The wreck showed how even massive steel hulls can be compromised when cargo, waves, and weather align in deadly combination. Cyclops was built for coal, not for ore. Coal is lighter, easier to trim, and less likely to create extreme concentrated loads. By taking manganese, the ship entered new risk territory. Some reports suggest her holds may not have been fully compartmentalized for this cargo. If ore piled unevenly, it could hammer the bulkheads as the ship rolled. Imagine a single bulkhead giving way under pressure. Ore rushes to one side. The ship heels. Water enters through weakened seams. Pumps cannot keep up. Within minutes, a 19,000-ton ship could founder. A key point: manganese ore absorbs water.
If seawater entered the hold, the ore would become heavier and more compact, accelerating the sinking. Sailors call this a dead weight effect. The ship would not only list, but would sink like stone. This explanation matches the silence. No time for a distress call. The crew likely had only minutes, maybe seconds.
Cyclops's keel was laid in 1910, and she entered service in 1917. That means her design predated the war by years. While she was modern in size, she lacked wartime innovations in structural reinforcement. Her length was 542 feet, beam 65 feet, displacement nearly 20,000 tons. She was a giant, but not invincible. Her massive coal bunker-style holds were retrofitted for ore, which strains differently. Naval engineers reviewing similar colliers noted that constant flexing in heavy seas caused microfractures in steel plates. Over time, these invisible cracks weakened the hull. There are stories of Cyclops showing fatigue even before her last voyage. One record hints at repairs done to her deck and side plating in earlier years. If those fixes were temporary, the strain of heavy ore could have widened them. A single structural failure might cascade. Critics of this theory argue, if Cyclops was so weak, why did she make it safely to Barbados? But structural failure is not constant. A ship can survive days of calm, then break apart in hours when weather and cargo combine in the wrong way. Think of an airplane with hidden cracks in its fuselage. It can fly dozens of times without incident. But one day, in turbulent skies, the cracks give way. Catastrophe is sudden, not gradual. Cyclops may have been in exactly that position.
The argument against the storm theory is strong. Weather reports show no hurricanes or major squalls in the area. Yet weather is not always predictable, especially in 1918. Ships reported no great storms, but smaller systems could have passed unseen. Tropical depressions often form in the mid-Atlantic. With today's satellites, we catch them early. In 1918, only ships at sea could report them. If no one crossed that exact stretch at that exact time, then history records nothing. Even a minor storm could be enough. Cyclops, already stressed by our ore, might have faced seas higher than her hull could tolerate. In combination with her weakened structure, even moderate waves might have been fatal. The rogue wave theory deserves special attention. Modern oceanography has confirmed waves of extreme height and force appear without warning, created when wave systems intersect and reinforce each other. These waves can reach 80 to 100 feet. Such a wave could snap a ship in two, crush decks, or roll her instantly. Survivors of other incidents describe ships being struck as if by a wall of moving steel. If Cyclops encountered such a wave, the combination of weight, structure, and poor cargo stability could mean instant death.
Let's revisit the German submarine angle with more precision. In March 1918, U-boat operations were concentrated in the North Atlantic, near shipping lanes feeding Britain and France. Few German submarines operated deep in the Caribbean. The reason was simple: range and refueling. Submarines of that era had limited endurance. Venturing as far south as Barbados meant enormous fuel expenditure. War records backed this up. After the war, Germany surrendered logs and patrol records. None mention Cyclops. None claim responsibility. This silence is deafening. Had Germany sunk Cyclops, it would have been a propaganda victory. They would have shouted it to the world. There is another point. Survivors from U-boat sinkings usually existed. German captains sometimes gave time for evacuation. In Cyclops' case, no lifeboats were found, no debris. A torpedo strike typically leaves wreckage. Wood, oil slicks, cargo, something always rises. But with Cyclops, nothing surfaced. That silence again favors a catastrophic structural failure over attack. Thus, the U-boat theory is emotionally satisfying, but historically hollow.
No investigation of Cyclops is complete without Captain George W. Worley. Born in Germany as Johann Friedrich Wickmann, he immigrated to the U.S. and later joined the merchant service. By the 1910s, he commanded large naval colliers. But his reputation was stained. Crew members described him as authoritarian, even abusive. One report said he wore slippers and pajamas while commanding, carrying a cane and berating officers. Another accused him of paranoia, claiming he spied on his men and punished them harshly. Such stories circulated widely after the disappearance. Newspapers painted Worley as a tyrant. Theories of mutiny sprang up, fueled by dislike for his leadership. His German birth fed wartime suspicion. Could he have been a traitor? But reality complicates the picture. Despite his quirks, Worley had commanded multiple voyages without disaster. The Navy trusted him with their largest collier. No evidence links him to espionage. The accusations of mutiny rest on rumor, not proof. Still, one must ask, did his poor leadership affect safety? A captain sets tone and discipline. If his crew distrusted him, their performance might have been weaker. In emergencies, discipline saves lives. If crew morale was low, their response to crisis might have faltered. That could explain why no distress call was made. So while mutiny is unlikely, morale issues could still have contributed indirectly.
Sabotage was on everyone's mind in 1918. German agents had bombed U.S. factories. Saboteurs had set fires on ships. Espionage was real, but was it aboard Cyclops? Investigators found no sign. The ship left Barbados intact. No explosions were heard. No debris indicated fire. Sabotage cannot be ruled out entirely, but it lacks evidence. This theory, like mutiny, is more reflection of wartime paranoia than reality. People wanted someone to blame. An accident felt random, meaningless. A saboteur gave shape to fear.
By the 1960s, writers like Vincent Gaddis folded Cyclops into the Bermuda Triangle narrative. They spoke of supernatural vortices, time warps, alien abductions. But none of these theories existed in 1918. The truth is simple. The so-called Bermuda Triangle is one of the most heavily trafficked shipping zones on Earth. Thousands of ships and planes pass through safely. Yes, some vanish, but no more than in any comparably busy oceanic region. Cyclops' disappearance helped fuel the myth, but the myth explains nothing. The only mystery is why serious people took the triangle seriously at all.
When all theories are weighed, the likeliest culprit is structural weakness amplified by cargo instability. The manganese ore was unforgiving. The ship was vulnerable. The seas, while not extreme, need not have been violent. All it would take was one sudden roll, one crack widening, one bulkhead giving way. In combination, these factors point toward a catastrophic structural failure. Silence fits this theory. No wreckage fits this theory. The lack of enemy claim fits this theory. And yet, because the wreck has never been located, certainty eludes us. Each theory remains on the table, if only faintly. But the balance of evidence tilts strongly toward accident, not enemy, not mutiny, not myth.
The journey of USS Cyclops was more than a routine supply run. It was the lifeline of America's wartime industry, carrying manganese ore that was essential for hardening steel. Without manganese, American factories could not keep up with the production of weapons, armor, and naval vessels. Every crate stored deep in the Cyclops' massive cargo hold represented the endurance of an army thousands of miles away. The ship was not only transporting ore, it was transporting the very ability to wage modern war. The men on board knew their role. Though few of them were scientists or strategists, they understood that their cargo mattered. Many of the sailors had spent months in constant service, shifting from one Caribbean port to another, hauling supplies, coal, and ore. Life was repetitive but heavy with purpose. They were part of something larger, though they could not have guessed how history would later remember their voyage. Captain George W. Worley commanded the vessel. His reputation was complicated. Some sailors respected his discipline, others quietly resented his temper. He was known for a strict sense of authority, sometimes harsh, sometimes eccentric. Born in Germany and later immigrating to the United States, he was a career officer whose origins would eventually fuel dark speculation after the ship's disappearance. In the climate of 1918, when suspicion toward anything German ran high, the background of the captain seemed to cast an ominous shadow. When the ship departed from Barbados on March 4, 1918, the day was calm, the Caribbean sun bright. Witnesses on shore later recalled that nothing seemed unusual about the departure. The vessel was in good condition. The cargo was properly secured. The men aboard were weary but steady. There was no reason to suspect disaster was only days away. At the time of departure, there were 306 souls on board, officers, sailors, engineers, and even a few passengers making their way back to the United States. Among them were families of naval men, civilian workers, and contractors. Their names filled Navy rosters that would later be read with solemn weight. Many came from small towns scattered across the Midwest and East Coast, men who had never seen such a massive ship until the day they boarded. For some, it was their first voyage. For others, it was one of many in a long career of service. The sea between Barbados and Baltimore was not unfamiliar to the U.S. Navy. Ships passed along this route routinely, carrying supplies up the eastern seaboard. It was a long journey, but not unusually dangerous.
By March 1918, German U-boats were a threat in the Atlantic, but most were concentrated near Europe. Few were expected to patrol deep into the Caribbean. Still, the war was never far from the sailors' minds. Rumors of submarine attacks traveled quickly among naval crews. Everyone had heard the stories of merchant vessels vanishing in torpedo strikes, leaving little but oil slicks and scattered wreckage. But on that morning, the Cyclops steamed out with no sign of trouble. The engines rumbled steadily, pushing the giant bulk northward. The ocean spread before them, calm and endless. The sailors carried out their duties with practiced efficiency. Watch rotations, engine maintenance, navigation checks. Some men wrote letters they hoped to post when they reached Baltimore. Others gathered on deck, smoking cigarettes and sharing jokes, unaware their words would be the last anyone heard from them. The voyage began like any other. But after departure, silence. No further communications reached the shore. No radio messages, no distress calls, not even a fragment of static, as if the ship had dissolved into the sea air. Days passed. Families waited for news. Ports along the route prepared to receive the vessel, but it never arrived. At first, delays were not alarming. Ocean travel was unpredictable, subject to weather and mechanical setbacks. But as the days stretched into weeks, hope began to erode. Telegrams were sent to naval offices. Relatives begged for updates. Newspapers caught whispers of a missing vessel, and soon headlines carried the question, "Where is the USS Cyclops?" The Navy launched inquiries. Ships were dispatched to scour the waters along Cyclops' projected route. They searched for debris, oil slicks, anything that could suggest a sinking. But the ocean gave back nothing. Not a single lifeboat, not a scrap of timber. As if 19,000 tons of steel and 306 human lives had been swallowed whole. The absence of wreckage was the most haunting detail. Ships that sink in storms often leave traces: planks, barrels, floating cargo. Torpedo victims leave oil stains and twisted wreckage, but Cyclops left behind only absence. For the families waiting back home, that silence was unbearable. Without evidence, there was no closure, only mystery. Captain Worley became a figure of speculation. Some accused him of negligence. Others whispered that his German birth meant that he might have betrayed the ship, perhaps even defected to the enemy. No proof supported these claims, but in wartime America, suspicion was enough to stain his memory. In bars, on street corners, and in family kitchens, the questions lingered. Did the captain sabotage his own ship? Did a U-boat lie in wait? Or did the sea itself claim the vessel in a freak accident? The U.S. Navy released official statements. They confirmed the ship was overdue, missing, presumed lost. President Woodrow Wilson later described it as a mystery surpassing all other naval disappearances in American history. The weight of the loss was not only emotional, but strategic. With the ore gone, factories faced shortages. The war machine slowed, if only briefly. It was a reminder that a single ship could alter the course of industrial warfare. As search efforts continued, hope faded. The families received formal notifications. Letters arrived with devastating finality. Their sons, husbands, brothers were missing, likely dead. Yet, even in mourning, uncertainty gnawed at them. Without wreckage, without bodies, grief remained suspended. Mothers kept lamps burning in windows. Wives left chairs empty at dinner tables, holding on to the fragile belief that perhaps, somehow, their loved ones might return. The mystery deepened when the sea remained stubbornly silent. Weeks turned into months. Cyclops did not reappear. No survivors drifted ashore on lifeboats. No foreign port reported an unexpected arrival. The Atlantic had claimed ships before, but rarely without a trace. For sailors across the Navy, the Vanishing was a grim reminder of their own vulnerability. Even the largest steel vessel could vanish without warning. The world was at war, but the disappearance of Cyclops carried a different kind of terror. It was not an enemy attack recorded in the heat of battle. It was not a storm witnessed by survivors. It was absence, pure and unexplained. And in that void, imagination flourished. Some believed the ship had been pulled into a violent storm no one recorded. Others suspected a sudden structural failure. The most dramatic whispered that the vessel had simply fallen into a realm beyond the known world. But at the time, these were only whispers. For the families, the unanswered question was sharper. How could the sea take everything and give nothing back?
On board the USS Cyclops, life was a blend of routine, responsibility, and anticipation. For most sailors, days blurred together into cycles of watches, meals, and the constant hum of engines below deck. Yet within this monotony, each man carried his own world, stories of families, letters tucked into sea bags, ambitions waiting on the shores they hoped to return to. Among the ranks were immigrants who had only recently pledged allegiance to the United States. Many had signed up during wartime, hoping that military service would fast-track their acceptance into American life. For them,
Wearing the Navy uniform was not just about serving in a global conflict, but also about proving loyalty to their adopted homeland. They worked side by side with farm boys from Kansas, dock workers from New Jersey, and fishermen from Maine. The diversity mirrored the American story itself, a nation of individuals bound together by duty, heading into uncertain waters.
Descriptions from crew lists show how varied the ages were. Some sailors were barely 19, freshly recruited, and still adjusting to life at sea. Others were veterans of previous voyages, men who had sailed across oceans before and knew the rhythm of long deployments. The ship was its own floating society, with unwritten rules, friendships, rivalries, and moments of solidarity that only those aboard could fully grasp. Letters that survived in archives, kept because families never stopped treasuring the last words, paint a picture of ordinary men thinking of simple things. One sailor wrote to his mother about missing her cooking. Another mentioned the excitement of seeing Caribbean ports, though he confessed that the heat was relentless below decks. A third told his wife to keep faith, promising he would be home soon. None could imagine those words would be the last.
Descriptions from crew lists show how varied the ages were. Some sailors were barely 19, freshly recruited, and still adjusting to life at sea. Others were veterans of previous voyages, men who had sailed across oceans before and knew the rhythm of long deployments. The ship was its own floating society, with unwritten rules, friendships, rivalries, and moments of solidarity that only those aboard could fully grasp. Letters that survived in archives, kept because families never stopped treasuring the last words, paint a picture of ordinary men thinking of simple things. One sailor wrote to his mother about missing her cooking, another mentioned the excitement of seeing Caribbean ports, though he confessed that the heat was relentless below decks. A third told his wife to keep faith, promising he would be home soon. None could imagine those words would be the last.
Life aboard was organized by the ship's bell and the Navy's rigid schedules. Sailors rotated through watches, manning stations through day and night. Engine crews worked in sweltering conditions, tending the massive coal-fed engines that powered the vessel. Their bodies were streaked with sweat and soot, yet without them, the Cyclops would never have moved. On deck, sailors chipped paint, polished brass, and maintained the endless fittings of the ship. Others assisted in navigating or stood lookout, scanning the endless horizon. In their free hours, they smoked, played cards, and swapped stories about towns far from the Caribbean sun. Despite the war, laughter echoed in those moments. They were young men, and even in duty, they sought joy.
Captain George Worley remained a complex figure among them. Some respected his strict discipline, while others whispered about his temper. Allegations would later emerge about his pro-German sympathies, sparking controversy and suspicion after the ship's disappearance. But in those final weeks, he commanded the ship with authority, overseeing not only the transport of manganese ore, but also the well-being of more than 300 souls. His decisions carried weight, and every sailor's fate was tied to his leadership. In Barbados, before departure on March 4, 1918, sailors mingled with locals, stocked provisions, and prepared for what they assumed would be another uneventful leg of service. Witnesses remembered their presence in town, groups of men laughing together, buying trinkets, or writing postcards to send home. Nothing suggested doom. To those ashore, they were just another Navy crew, passing through on a wartime mission. Families back home carried on with daily life, unaware that the next time their sons' names appeared in newspapers, it would be in the context of tragedy. For many households, the war had already taken much. The disappearance of Cyclops would add to that grief in ways no one could prepare for.
Among the 306 souls, stories stand out. Lieutenant Clarence Nelson, an officer known for his diligence, had written detailed logs in previous voyages. His absence left a void in Navy records. Engineer Charles Merrick had spent years mastering the technical aspects of marine engines. Ordinary seaman William Thompson had just turned 21 and told his family he looked forward to buying a farm after the war. Their individual stories remind us that behind the numbers were lives as rich and fragile as any.
As the ship left Barbados and pushed into open waters, few could predict that this would be the last time Cyclops would ever be seen. The men carried on as usual, not knowing that their names would soon become part of one of America's greatest maritime mysteries. The decks were busy, the holds full of manganese ore, the engines roaring. The ocean stretched out before them, deceptively calm. When history later recorded the ship's vanishing, it would often reduce the crew to a statistic: 306 souls lost. But in truth, each was an individual,
with loved ones who waited, prayed, and mourned. Their absence reshaped families, left mothers childless, wives widowed, and children fatherless. To understand Cyclops, one must remember them not as a faceless mass, but as men who lived, hoped, and laughed until the seas swallowed them whole.
This section of the story is not about steel or strategy, but about humanity. The USS Cyclops was more than a vessel. It was a community of men bound by circumstance, courage, and the fragility of life in wartime. By revisiting their lives, we do justice to their memory, reminding ourselves that history's mysteries are built on human stories.
March 4, 1918. The USS Cyclops lifted anchor from Bridgetown, Barbados. The ship carried over 10,000 tons of manganese ore, critical for steel production during the war. Its destination was Baltimore, Maryland. On paper, it was a straightforward journey. Sail northwest through the Caribbean, cross into the Atlantic, and head up the coast. Thousands of ships had done it before, yet this voyage would become a legend. Local witnesses recalled seeing the ship as it departed. It was steady, engines thundering, sailors visible on deck. Nothing suggested distress. Weather reports that day described favorable conditions, though pockets of squalls dotted the Caribbean. The last official communication from Cyclops gave no indication of trouble. It was business as usual. That silence would later fuel endless speculation. From the moment it cleared Barbados, the ship entered what we now call the Bermuda Triangle, though at the time the phrase had not yet been coined. This stretch of ocean, between Florida, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, had already seen unexplained vanishings, but Cyclops would become its most famous wartime casualty.
Navy protocol required ships to send signals, progress updates, or at least radio checks when passing certain coordinates. Cyclops did none of these after leaving port. No message of delay, no distress call, no SOS. Weeks later, when the ship failed to appear in Baltimore, alarms went off at the highest levels of the Navy. This was no small schooner. It was one of the largest vessels of its class, carrying cargo vital for the war. To vanish without a word seemed impossible. The waiting families first believed in delays. Some assumed storms slowed the ship. Others imagined mechanical issues. But as days turned into weeks, hope thinned. By April, it was clear something catastrophic had occurred.
At first, the Navy considered mechanical failure. Could the heavy cargo have destabilized the vessel? Was the ship overloaded? Investigators later confirmed the manganese ore was within acceptable limits. Still, the possibility of sudden structural failure lingered. A broken keel, a hull breach, or engine explosion could sink even a giant. Another theory was weather. Though reports suggested fair skies, storms in the Atlantic could emerge quickly. Yet even in violent seas, ships usually managed to transmit distress calls. Cyclops had powerful radio equipment. Its silence puzzled experts. For such a large vessel, not a single plank, lifeboat, or piece of cargo ever washed ashore. That absence made the case chilling. The later fame of the Bermuda Triangle owes much to Cyclops. In post-war decades, writers pointed to its disappearance as proof that this patch of ocean concealed secrets. To skeptics, this was superstition. Yet even among Navy records, the total absence of wreckage raised eyebrows. This was not an era without salvage crews or coastal patrols. Other wartime sinkings left debris. Cyclops left nothing.
For the families, the disappearance was devastating. They received official telegrams, missing and presumed lost. That phrase offered no closure. It did not explain how or why. It left uncertainty that haunted widows and parents for decades. Some clung to rumors that the crew had been captured, or that they would return when the war ended. Others resigned themselves to grief. The tragedy was compounded by the lack of bodies to bury, forcing families to mourn without graves.
The U.S. government released few details. Wartime secrecy prevented speculation about enemy involvement from spreading too far. Some suspected a German U-boat ambush, yet no German records after the war confirmed this. The German Navy, meticulous in its logs, had no claim of sinking such a large vessel at that time and place. Without evidence, the theory stalled. In hushed tones, conspiracy theories began. Some whispered sabotage from within, pointing to Captain Worley's questionable loyalties. Others spoke of mutiny or deliberate scuttling. Without proof, these remained shadows, but the mystery fed them.
The Atlantic in those weeks remained indifferent. Merchant ships passed through the same waters without incident. Naval patrols scoured the region, but saw no oil slick, no floating timber, no life raft. It was as if Cyclops had been erased from reality. One officer later remarked, "Ships sink, but ships leave signs. This one left none." That statement captured the enigma. For a vessel nearly 550 feet long, disappearance without a trace felt unnatural.
As news spread across the United States, newspapers latched onto the drama. Headlines shouted, "Navy collier vanishes," and "No word from giant ship." For the public, it became more than a wartime loss. It became a haunting riddle. In Baltimore, where families waited on the docks, the sight of an empty horizon seared into memory. The Cyclops had departed in plain view. It never returned.
When the USS Cyclops failed to appear in Baltimore, the U.S. Navy initiated one of its largest searches of the era. Warships swept the shipping lanes from the Caribbean to the mid-Atlantic. Radio towers listened for faint signals. Patrol aircraft scanned the waves. Nothing. Days of searching yielded no sighting of lifeboats, wreckage, or oil. For a ship of that size, the total absence stunned investigators. The Navy's official inquiry began with a simple question: how does a ship of nearly 20,000 tons disappear silently? The answer never came. Records show that officers pressed every angle: mechanical failure, sabotage, enemy action, weather. None provided certainty.
In 1918, German submarines stalked the Atlantic. U-boats were notorious for sinking Allied cargo ships without warning. For many, this was the logical explanation. Cyclops had been torpedoed. Yet when the war ended, Allied intelligence reviewed German naval logs. None mentioned sinking such a ship. Captains who had no reason to conceal their victories remained silent. To this day, no German claim exists. Even more telling, a torpedo strike on a vessel like Cyclops would have been violent. Survivors, debris, and oil slicks almost always followed. Patrols should have spotted something. They did not. Attention then turned to the man in command. Captain George W. Worley, born Johann Friedrich Wiechmann, had emigrated from Germany years earlier. His background raised eyebrows. Reports circulated that he favored German customs, spoke harshly to his crew, and displayed erratic behavior. Some sailors accused him of disloyalty. Could he have betrayed his command, sabotaged the ship, defected to Germany? The Navy investigated. No evidence supported these claims, but the rumors stuck. To grieving families, it offered a villain, however unproven.
Another possibility was sabotage, either by crew or external agents. During World War I, sabotage of ships was not unheard of. Explosives planted in coal bunkers could destroy a vessel from within. The Cyclops carried tons of manganese ore, a dense, heavy cargo. If improperly loaded or tampered with, it could destabilize the ship. Yet investigators noted that no explosion was ever reported. Residents in Barbados and nearby islands heard nothing unusual. A sabotage plot without witnesses seemed unlikely.
Cyclops was a massive ship, but not immune to stress. Naval architects later suggested a structural failure. The ship had a single engine. If it lost power in heavy seas, it could drift sideways into waves, risking capsizing. Some speculated the keel snapped under strain. This would explain the suddenness, but not the total absence of wreckage.
While the Navy probed technical causes, the American press spun mystery. Newspapers sold headlines about the ghost ship. Journalists emphasized the silence. No SOS, no flares, no wreckage. The word vanished appeared again and again. For a public weary of war, the story was both tragedy and thrill. Mothers wrote letters to Congress. Widows begged for answers. Politicians demanded reports. The Navy issued a cautious statement. She was lost without trace. No enemy has accounted for her fate. That line did not satisfy anyone.
In Baltimore and Norfolk, sailors swapped stories. Some claimed Cyclops had been seen secretly entering a German port. Others swore it had been taken by mutiny. A few believed it had sunk quickly and silently, the ocean sealing its grave. Dock sidebars echoed with these tales, each more dramatic than the last. For families, each rumor offered fragile hope or crushing despair. The uncertainty was worse than death itself.
Although the Bermuda Triangle label was not used until the mid-20th century, seafarers already whispered about strange disappearances in those waters.
Cyclops fit the pattern: a massive ship, fair weather, total silence. Over time, this association would elevate the case from wartime tragedy to maritime legend.
By June 1918, the Navy ended active searching. The official record declared the USS Cyclops missing, presumed lost with all 306 souls. It was the single largest non-combat loss of life in U.S. naval history at the time. With no evidence, no wreck, and no survivors, the file remained open-ended. The lack of closure became the story itself. Unlike ships sunk in battle where survivors returned with tales of fire and chaos, Cyclops left nothing but absence. The silence spoke louder than any explanation.
When World War I ended in November 1918, Allied forces gained access to German records. Intelligence officers combed through captured U-boat logs hoping for mention of Cyclops. They found none. German submarine captains meticulously reported their sinkings, often boasting of successful attacks. The absence of any entry about such a large ship deepened the puzzle. Naval historians reviewed the inquiry. Some pointed out gaps in the investigation, noting that wartime urgency may have forced quick conclusions. Others argued that even in peacetime, nothing more could have been found. The ocean had already claimed the evidence. By 1919, the Navy issued its final position. The USS Cyclops was lost, without a trace. No cause could be established. Families received formal notices. Compensation was paid. Memorials listed the names of the 306 sailors and passengers. In official terms, the case was closed. In the public mind, it had just begun.
In the years that followed, stories emerged of ships spotting something unusual. One freighter captain claimed he saw a vessel resembling Cyclops far from its intended route, sailing northward without signaling. Another rumor placed it near the Azores, though details were vague. None of these sightings were confirmed. Other tales suggested survivors had reached remote islands. Newspapers occasionally ran headlines about Cyclops men found, only to retract them days later. Each false lead kept the story alive.
306 men vanished. Their absence haunted port cities. In Norfolk, wives raised children who never knew their fathers. In Baltimore, dock workers kept quiet to avoid upsetting families. The Navy held remembrance ceremonies, but grief without bodies lingered. Families created their own explanations. Some believed the men had drowned quickly, mercifully, spared suffering. Others believed the Navy knew more than it admitted, covering up a scandal. Conspiracy grew from silence.
Unlike ships sunk in known battles, where wrecks could later be located, Cyclops remained invisible. That invisibility gave it a ghostly quality. In seafaring lore, a ship without a wreck is never truly gone. It sails on, in imagination, if not in reality. In the years that followed, stories emerged of ships spotting something unusual. One freighter captain claimed he saw a vessel resembling Cyclops far from its intended route, sailing northward without signaling. Another rumor placed it near the Azores, though details were vague. None of these sightings were confirmed. Other tales suggested survivors had reached remote islands. Newspapers occasionally ran headlines about Cyclops men found, only to retract them days later. Each false lead kept the story alive. As decades passed, the theories multiplied. Some believed Captain Worley had turned traitor, steering the ship into a German port. Others imagined secret cargo, munitions, or dangerous chemicals that caused a hidden explosion. A few even claimed the ship had been experimenting with new technology, disappearing into classified history. Each generation added new layers. The lack of wreckage allowed imagination free rein.
By the 1950s, magazines seeking sensational stories began printing dramatic accounts of lost ships. Cyclops appeared alongside the Mary Celeste, the Flying Dutchman, and other maritime mysteries. The story shifted from a wartime tragedy to a pop culture enigma. Writers exaggerated details. Some claimed the ship disappeared in calm seas under clear skies, ignoring reports of heavy weather. Others suggested a supernatural force. The story evolved, divorced from its origins, but always anchored by one fact: 306 men vanished without a word.
The Navy rarely commented after its final report. When pressed by journalists, spokesmen repeated the line, "She was lost, cause unknown." The lack of engagement fueled suspicion. Was the Navy hiding something, or was it simply unwilling to speculate?
Even into the 1930s, letters arrived at Navy offices. Widows and children asked for updates. Some sent in rumors they had heard, hoping officials would investigate. Most were politely dismissed. For the relatives, the unanswered questions kept grief alive.
By the time the Bermuda Triangle became a household term in the mid-20th century, Cyclops had already become legend. It was no longer just a naval ship lost in war. It was a symbol of the ocean's power to erase. For historians, the challenge remained, separating fact from fiction. The war records, ship logs, and testimonies were real. The theories, however, spun into folklore. The USS Cyclops existed in both worlds, documented history and enduring myth.
When World War II ended, advances in sonar and undersea detection changed naval exploration. Submarines had pushed technology forward. Minesweepers and survey ships could now map the seabed. Some Navy officers quietly suggested using these tools to search for Cyclops. The idea lingered, but the Navy had no operational reason to commit resources. The war had left thousands of ships sunk across the Atlantic. Searching for one lost collier from 1918 was not a priority. Still, the absence of Cyclops continued to haunt naval records.
In the 1950s and 1960s, popular writers brought the story back into public consciousness. As books like The Bermuda Triangle by Vincent Gaddis, 1964, reached audiences, Cyclops became central to the Triangle mystery. Gaddis and later Charles Berlitz wrote with dramatic flair, suggesting supernatural causes. This shift pulled the ship from Navy archives into living rooms. Television specials featured it. Documentaries treated it as one of the greatest mysteries of the sea.
Not everyone bought this supernatural claims. In the 1970s and 80s, skeptics like Larry Kusch examined the records. They argued that many so-called triangle mysteries were exaggerated. In Cyclops' case, they noted the ship was overloaded with manganese ore. Its engines had shown problems before. The route crossed rough seas. Captain Worley was controversial. To them, the disappearance was tragic, but not supernatural. Yet the public preferred mystery to mundane answers.
By the late 20th century, sonar mapping had improved. The Navy and later private companies scanned parts of the Atlantic looking for shipwrecks. Some expeditions hoped to stumble upon Cyclops. None did. Oceanographers pointed out the challenge. The Atlantic seafloor is vast and deep, with ridges, trenches, and canyons. A wreck could lie buried under silt, invisible to scanners. The manganese ore itself might have shifted, crushing the hull and scattering debris.
Every few years, reports surfaced of possible discoveries. In 1968, divers claimed to find a massive wreck off the coast of Brazil. It turned out to be another vessel. In the 1990s, sonar operators thought they spotted something near Barbados, but surveys showed it was a natural formation. Each false lead reinforced the mystery. If such a large ship could not be found, perhaps it truly had vanished into myth.
Independent researchers launched small-scale searches. Some used fishing boats with sonar. Others raised funds for diving expeditions. None succeeded. The depth, currents, and remoteness made amateur efforts nearly impossible. For families of the lost, these expeditions brought hope and disappointment in equal measure. The U.S. Navy, when asked in the 21st century, repeats the same line. The ship was lost, cause unknown. The official file has not changed since 1919. Declassification has revealed no hidden reports. No secret conclusion waits in archives. To historians, this silence is not conspiracy. It is simply that the Navy reached the limits of evidence a century ago. To the public, however, it feels unsatisfying.
The USS Cyclops now belongs as much to legend as to history. Documentaries still cover it, novels and films borrow from it. In the United States, it represents both the power of the sea and the limits of human knowledge. In maritime museums, its story is displayed alongside other mysteries. At memorial services, its crew is honored with sailors lost in war. The myth fuels imagination, but the memory honors sacrifice.
Modern technology offers new hope. Autonomous underwater vehicles, AUVs, can scan at depths far beyond what was possible in 1918, or even 1968. Satellite oceanography helps narrow search zones. Projects like those that found the Titanic prove that such wrecks can be discovered. The barrier is funding. Searching the deep Atlantic is expensive. Unless a government or major sponsor commits, Cyclops may remain hidden. To this day, no distress call, no wreckage, no survivor account has surfaced. The manganese ore, which could have explained overloading or shifting cargo, is gone with the ship. Captain Worley's intentions, the weather's exact impact, and the ship's final hours are unknowable. What remains is absence, and in that absence, history and myth continue to meet.
The USS Cyclops stands as one of the largest non-combat losses in U.S. Navy history. It is remembered not only for the mystery, but for the men who never returned. In Norfolk, in Baltimore, in towns across America, families kept portraits on mantels, letters in drawers, and memories alive. For them, the story is not about the Bermuda Triangle or conspiracy. It is about loved ones lost without goodbye. And for history, the lesson endures. Even in the modern age of steel and engines, the ocean holds power beyond control.
When the USS Cyclops vanished, the U.S. Navy lost more than a ship. It lost confidence. The Navy had already grown into a world power during World War I, projecting American force across the Atlantic. The loss of a massive collier without trace was a reminder that technology had limits. Naval planners studied the disappearance, but without evidence, they could only guess. Was the ship structurally unsound? Was manganese ore poorly secured? Did enemy action occur undetected? None of these questions found answers. The scar was psychological as much as operational. For decades, sailors who served on similar colliers remembered Cyclops as a ghost in their fleet lineage.
For 306 families, the loss was personal. Widows filed for pensions. Parents waited for letters that never came. Children grew up with fathers missing from photographs. The Navy issued death certificates, but without remains, the closure was incomplete. Some families clung to hope for years, believing the ship might be found or men rescued. Newspapers occasionally fanned these hopes, publishing rumors of sightings. Each turned out false. With time, the grief hardened into generational memory.
In strategic terms, the disappearance showed the vulnerability of supply chains. Warships depended on fuel, ammunition, and material transported by support vessels. Losing a collier with no warning exposed risk. After 1918, the Navy diversified logistics. It built more colliers and later shifted to oilers as coal phased out. But Cyclops remained a case study. Manuals noted the need for proper cargo distribution and reinforced structural stability. Though not always spoken aloud, officers used Cyclops as a cautionary example. If a supply ship failed, entire fleets could suffer.
The Cyclops was not alone. History records other ships that vanished without trace. HMS Atalanta, 1880, a British training ship, disappeared in the Atlantic with 281 aboard. No wreckage ever found. Waratah, 1909, an Australian passenger liner carrying 211 people, vanished off South Africa, still undiscovered. USS 09, 1941, a submarine lost off New Hampshire with 33 men. Its wreck was found only decades later. These examples show that Cyclops fits a broader pattern. The ocean swallows vessels, sometimes leaving no evidence. What made Cyclops unique was its size, the number of lives, and the wartime context.
By the mid-20th century, the disappearance had been folded into the Bermuda Triangle narrative. This changed how people remembered it. Instead of being a naval tragedy, it became a pop culture mystery. Writers placed it alongside vanished planes and ships, weaving a legend of cursed waters. For historians, this was frustrating. The real human cost was overshadowed by sensational theories. For the public, it kept the story alive, ensuring Cyclops was not forgotten.
During the Cold War, when nuclear submarines prowled the deep and spy ships monitored oceans, Cyclops resurfaced in imagination. Popular magazines speculated that it might have been sunk by a German U-boat or even captured secretly. These theories reflected Cold War paranoia more than 1918 reality. Yet they kept Cyclops relevant in an age when the sea was again seen as a theater of global conflict.
Unlike ships sunk in combat, Cyclops has no official gravesite. There is no wreck to place a plaque upon, no coordinates for a memorial dive. Instead, remembrance takes other forms. Names etched in Navy casualty lists, mentions in maritime museums, occasional Navy press releases on anniversaries. But the absence of a tangible memorial site gives the loss an unfinished air.
The Titanic sank in 1912, 6 years before Cyclops. But Titanic was found in 1985, its wreck haunting, yet visible. Families gained a gravesite, the world gained closure. Cyclops offers none of that. It is larger than many wrecks now located, yet it remains missing. That absence sharpens the mystery. Where Titanic became a cautionary tale about hubris, Cyclops became a reminder of the unknown.
Behind speculation and legend lies the crew. They were machinists, stokers, seamen, and officers. Many were immigrants. They served not for glory, but because the Navy offered work, stability, and identity. Their fate links them not to conspiracy, but to the timeless danger of the sea. Every generation of sailors knows this danger. For Cyclops' crew, the ocean became both workplace and tomb.
Unlike ships sunk in combat, Cyclops has no official gravesite. There is no wreck to place a plaque upon, no coordinates for a memorial dive. After the war, U.S. naval intelligence reviewed logs of German submarines, hoping to find a record of sinking Cyclops. None existed. The Germans were meticulous in reporting victories, both for propaganda and internal records. No U-boat claimed it. In the 1920s, survey ships attempted to trace Cyclops' last known route from Barbados toward Baltimore. Sonar technology was primitive. They found nothing. The Caribbean seabed is treacherous, filled with ridges, trenches, and volcanic slopes. Wreckage could rest thousands of feet below. At the time, it was beyond reach.
During the Cold War, the U.S. Navy invested in deep-sea mapping to track submarines. By the 1960s, sonar arrays could detect wrecks at depth. Some officers suggested searching for Cyclops. But priorities lay elsewhere: nuclear submarines, missile tracking, and Soviet threats. A collier lost in 1918 carried little strategic weight. No dedicated mission was assigned. Still, as sonar images accumulated, naval historians quietly hoped one would reveal the outline of a massive hull. None matched.
The discovery of Titanic in 1985 by Robert Ballard changed expectations. If Titanic could be found at 12,500 feet, perhaps Cyclops could too. Oceanographers noted that the region where Cyclops vanished was less explored than the North Atlantic. Funding, however, remained a challenge. Expeditions cost millions. Private donors were drawn to Titanic's romance, not a coal collier. Despite this, several exploratory missions in the 1990s and 2000s mapped Caribbean trenches. They discovered coral structures, volcanic vents, and wrecks of smaller ships, but no Cyclops.
Historians and engineers proposed explanations grounded in physics and naval architecture. Structural failure. The manganese ore may have been loaded unevenly, stressing the hull. Combined with rough seas, this could have snapped the keel. A sudden break would send the ship down in minutes. Storm sinking. Weather records show squalls in the region. A sudden storm could have capsized or overwhelmed the ship, especially with unstable cargo. Engine failure and drift. If the engine failed, Cyclops could have drifted into currents, carried far from search areas. A slow foundering might leave no time for signals. Sabotage. Given wartime paranoia, some speculated that German sympathizers aboard sabotaged the ship. Yet no evidence ever surfaced. Each theory has flaws. None fully explains the complete lack of debris.
Even a century later, descendants of the crew contact historians. They ask if new technologies might find the wreck. They ask if DNA recovery is possible. These questions reflect a deeper need: closure. The ocean denies it. As long as the wreck remains unseen, families live with absence.
The discovery of Titanic in 1985 by Robert Ballard changed expectations. If Titanic could be found at 12,500 feet, perhaps Cyclops could too. Oceanographers noted that the region where Cyclops vanished was less explored than the North Atlantic. Funding, however, remained a challenge. Expeditions cost millions. Private donors were drawn to Titanic's romance, not a coal collier. Despite this, several exploratory missions in the 1990s and 2000s mapped Caribbean trenches. They discovered coral structures, volcanic vents, and wrecks of smaller ships, but no Cyclops.
The ship has appeared in documentaries, books, and podcasts. Each retelling wrestles with the same problem: a mystery with no resolution. Some lean on fact, detailing the ship's last voyage.
Others embrace drama, suggesting conspiracies. For educators, the challenge is balancing intrigue with evidence.
Several factors explain why Cyclops has not been located. The seabed is vast, rugged, and unmapped in detail. The ship could have broken apart, scattering across slopes. Currents may have carried lighter debris far away. Search missions remain underfunded. Unlike Titanic or warships lost in famous battles, Cyclops lacks mass public funding. It waits for technology to catch up or for an expedition willing to take the gamble.
The mystery of Cyclops echoes in modern cases. Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370, 2014, a plane with 239 people vanished over the Indian Ocean. Despite advanced radar and satellite tracking, no wreck has been found. Argentine submarine Ara San Juan, 2017, lost with 44 crew. It took a year of international searching to locate. These show that even with modern tech, the ocean still hides. If 21st century vessels can vanish, how much more in 1918?
For naval historians, Cyclops is not a ghost story. It is a lesson in humility. Human technology bows before the ocean's scale. The ship's disappearance shaped how the Navy viewed cargo loading, emergency communications, and redundancy. Even without answers, the case changed practice. For culture, it remains a story of mystery. Writers, filmmakers, and storytellers return to it because the unknown exerts power.
Several factors explain why Cyclops has not been located. The seabed is vast, rugged, and unmapped in detail. The most haunting element of the USS Cyclops mystery is silence. No SOS, no debris, no trace. For sailors, silence at sea is the final verdict. A ship may burn, break, or founder, but usually it leaves a mark. Timbers, barrels, lifeboats. Cyclops left nothing. The ocean swallowed it whole. That absence became its legacy.
The U.S. Navy drew lessons. Cargo loading rules were revised with stricter attention to balance and stress distribution. Radio protocols were tightened. Ships were required to maintain stricter schedules of contact. Command oversight increased, especially for captains with unusual records like Worley. These reforms aimed to prevent another vanishing. The Navy acknowledged the sea's power, but also human error.
Behind the statistics, 306 men lie individual lives. Young sailors on their first deployment, seasoned engineers from the industrial Midwest, immigrants who saw naval service as citizenship's gateway. Some left behind wives who never remarried. Some left children who grew up with only a photograph. Families received no bodies, only official notices. Missing, presumed lost. That phrase carried no comfort. It hung in homes for decades, like unfinished sentences.
The mystery fed into literature and storytelling. Novelists invoked the ship in tales of cursed seas. Folklore embraced it as a modern Flying Dutchman. By the 1970s, the Bermuda Triangle craze pulled Cyclops deep into popular culture. Books sold millions. Television dramatized disappearances with eerie music and darkened maps. For audiences, fact blurred into myth. The ship became part of a supernatural narrative, even as historians pushed back.
Maritime scholars kept the case alive in journals and archives. They debated metallurgy, wave theory, and engineering. They examined Worley's records, searching for patterns of negligence or instability. Some pointed to manganese ore, noting its high density. Improperly secured, it could act like shifting ballast, pulling a ship over in seconds. Others questioned whether the ore itself, if wet, produced chemical reactions weakening the hold. Still, no single explanation closed the file. The academic debates mirrored the public's fascination, an appetite for answers unmet by evidence. Context matters. In 1918, the world was burning. The United States was still adjusting to global war. Germany's submarines prowled Atlantic waters. Against that backdrop, the loss of Cyclops was interpreted through fear. If it was not nature, then it must have been sabotage. If not sabotage, then espionage. Such theories reveal wartime psychology. When nations face threats, even natural disasters are viewed through suspicion.
Oceanographers remain optimistic. Modern remote-operated vehicles, ROVs, can descend miles deep. Multi-beam sonar can map seafloors in high resolution. The challenge is scale. Searching the ocean is like combing a desert with a flashlight. Still, breakthroughs happen. In recent decades, explorers have found warships, aircraft, and submarines once thought lost forever. If Cyclops is located, it would not only answer questions, it would return dignity to the 306 still entombed.
History records many vanishings. The USS Proteus and USS Nereus, sister ships of Cyclops, also disappeared during World War II. Both carried heavy cargoes of ore. Neither was found. Civilian freighters like Joyita and Carol A. Deering were discovered abandoned, crews gone. But Cyclops stands apart in scale. Its loss remains the single largest non-combat death toll in U.S. naval history not caused by enemy action.
Humans crave closure. When closure is denied, imagination fills the void. That is why Cyclops remains compelling after a century. The lack of wreckage keeps theories alive. The ship becomes a canvas where fears, hopes, and stories are painted. Some cling to rationality, engineering failure, storms, or cargo mishandling. Others embrace the supernatural, from triangle portals to alien abductions. Both responses reflect the same truth. Mystery unsettles us.
If the wreck is one day found, myths will fade. The Bermuda Triangle narrative will lose one of its pillars. Families may gain closure. Yet, paradoxically, part of the fascination will vanish too. Mysteries resolved rarely retain the same grip. For now, the Atlantic keeps its secret. Cyclops remains both a naval tragedy and a cultural legend.
History records many vanishings. The USS Proteus and USS Nereus, sister ships of Cyclops, also disappeared during World War II. Both carried heavy cargoes of ore. Neither was found. Civilian freighters like Joyita and Carol A. Deering were discovered abandoned, crews gone. But Cyclops stands apart in scale. Its loss remains the single largest non-combat death toll in U.S. naval history not caused by enemy action.
When a ship disappears, it leaves more than a void in the sea. It leaves a gap in memory, policy, and imagination. The USS Cyclops, with its 306 lost souls, became more than a missing vessel. It became a question mark carved into naval history. The impact radiated across decades. It shaped naval protocols, influenced maritime science, and seeded cultural myths that still echo today.
The case also pressed engineers to rethink shipbuilding. If a vessel could vanish without wreckage, perhaps the design itself required scrutiny. Cyclops was a collier, built for heavy cargo. Its long steel frame was strong, but stress points around the holds were vulnerable. Naval architects began to factor in the unique dangers of ore cargoes, which behaved differently from coal or grain. Future designs incorporated better compartmentalization and more sophisticated ballast systems. Safety evolved, not because the cause was known, but because the risk was undeniable.
Beyond metal and machinery, Cyclops forced the Navy to consider morale. The sudden loss of hundreds of men without explanation rattled the entire fleet. Families demanded answers. Newspapers amplified suspicions of German sabotage. Rumors spread among sailors that the ocean itself was cursed. The Navy responded by improving communication with families and the press. It learned that mystery breeds unrest, and that trust requires transparency, even when answers are missing. The USS Cyclops became a symbol not of war glory, but of war's unpredictability. In a conflict defined by trenches, machine guns, and U-boats, here was a different kind of loss, one without battle, without enemy fire, without survivors. This symbol carried weight in recruiting stations, in veterans halls, and in congressional hearings. It reminded Americans that service at sea carried risks invisible to the public eye.
By the mid-20th century, the story had shifted from tragedy to legend. Popular writers drew upon the Cyclops' disappearance to fuel tales of haunted seas and paranormal forces. The Bermuda Triangle narrative of the 1960s and 1970s found in Cyclops its crown jewel. A ship so large, so manned, so vital, gone without trace, became perfect evidence for those who argued that the ocean held secrets beyond science. Television dramatizations, books with ominous covers, and even schoolyard rumors gave the ship new life. What had been grief for families became entertainment for millions.
Historians pushed back.
They worked to reclaim the story from sensationalism. They combed through logs, naval memos, and engineering documents. Some argued the Bermuda Triangle narrative distorted reality. Cyclops did not vanish in mystery waters, they said, but in a region well-trafficked, where storms and structural failure sufficed as explanation. Still, their voices rarely reached as far as popular culture. Myths travel faster than footnotes.
The loss of Cyclops also influenced the way the Navy approached public morale during later conflicts. In World War II, when sister ships Proteus and Nereus vanished under similar conditions, the Navy was quicker to attribute the losses to natural causes, avoiding the spread of rumor. It also reinforced the Navy's commitment to redundancy: multiple supply ships, multiple communication lines, multiple checks. The idea was clear: never let one failure become one legend.
Today, the U.S. Navy still references the Cyclops case in discussions of risk management. It is taught as an example of uncertainty. Even with steel ships, global reach, and advanced command, the sea cannot be fully controlled. This awareness influences planning, from submarine deployment to carrier resupply. The ghost of Cyclops whispers that even superpowers must respect the ocean.
Each sailor had a life before Cyclops. Farmer sons from the Midwest, immigrants seeking opportunity, young men who had never before crossed an ocean. Military records preserved their names, but their stories faded. Unlike generals or admirals, common sailors left few traces. The mystery compounded their anonymity, turning them into a collective rather than individuals. Historians today try to reverse this. Projects to digitize naval rosters and personal letters aim to give each sailor a face. Museums in Maryland and naval academies in Annapolis have slowly begun to honor the crew not as a mass, but as men with lives cut short.
One often overlooked element is that Cyclops carried a racially diverse crew, including African American sailors. In an era when segregation still defined much of American life, the Navy offered limited but real paths of service. For these men, the loss was doubly tragic. Their stories rarely made headlines. When remembered, they were usually anonymous. Only in recent decades have researchers tried to recover their names, placing them within the broader narrative of Black military service during World War I. This matters because it highlights the hidden sacrifices of communities often left out of mainstream history. The sea erased them, but silence afterward nearly erased them again.
For 306 families, the loss was not abstract. It was immediate, personal, and devastating. Wives received telegrams with no explanation. Parents heard rumors but no certainty. Children grew up with portraits instead of fathers. In Baltimore, where the ship had strong ties, church services filled with mourning. The city had expected the ship's safe return. Instead, it absorbed shock after shock as the names of the missing were read aloud. Some families clung to hope. For years after the disappearance, letters arrived at naval offices asking whether survivors might be stranded on an island, imprisoned by an enemy, or hidden under assumed identities. No answer came.
The controversy around Captain Worley's alleged German sympathies spilled into public debate. Newspapers, hungry for wartime intrigue, cast him as a potential traitor. This stigmatized German-American communities already under suspicion. Some families of the lost sailors even blamed ethnic background as a cause. If the captain was German-born, they asked, could he have betrayed the ship? No evidence proved such claims, yet the rumor endured. It reflected America's wartime paranoia, where identity itself could become guilt.
Each sailor had a life before Cyclops. Farmers' sons from the Midwest, immigrants seeking opportunity, young men who had never before crossed an ocean. In universities, the Cyclops case entered studies of maritime failure. Naval historians compared it to earlier disappearances, like the Eurydice, 1878, and later losses, like the Proteus and Nereus. Professors used it to teach about incomplete records, reminding students that history is often constructed from fragments. When a ship vanishes, the archives vanish with it. Scholars must learn to read silence as carefully as text. Engineering departments also studied the case. The behavior of manganese ore under stress became a subject of research in materials science. This research influenced not only naval cargo handling, but also commercial shipping practices.
For civilians, the mystery carried romance. Shipwrecks had always captured the imagination, but a vanishing without wreckage stirred something deeper. Writers turned it into poetry. Novelists borrowed it as plot.
Tour guides in the Caribbean whispered about it. Even without evidence, the story grew. The loss of Cyclops became not just a naval matter, but a piece of cultural folklore. Like the Flying Dutchman, it was retold at docks, bars, and classrooms.
Unlike great battles, Cyclops did not have a monument. Arlington Cemetery carried no dedicated marker. Only family graves bore the names. In 2018, on the centennial of the loss, some naval institutions held remembrance ceremonies. Bells were tolled, wreaths placed upon the water. For many descendants, it was the first formal acknowledgement in a century. Such acts matter. They reframe the story not as mystery alone, but as sacrifice. Behind theories and speculation lies a human cost.
The Cyclops tragedy contributed to a broader cultural awareness. The sea is not conquered. Even in the 20th century, even with steel ships and radios, the ocean remained a realm of risk. This awareness seeped into literature, film, and education. Teachers pointed to Cyclops when discussing the limits of technology. Writers used it as shorthand for unresolved fate. It reinforced a theme older than navies, that humans, no matter how advanced, are temporary guests on the waters.
The Navy did not treat the loss of Cyclops as an isolated accident. It became a case study. Cargo handling procedures changed. Inspectors paid closer attention to the properties of bulk ore and coal. War planners realized that non-combat losses could rival combat casualties. A single logistical failure could cripple fleets. The lesson echoed through later wars, influencing how the Navy structured supply convoys in World War II. Ships were redesigned with stronger hulls, better balance systems, and more redundancy. In that sense, the silent grave of Cyclops indirectly saved future lives.
Oceanographers saw opportunity in the disappearance. If a steel giant could vanish, then the ocean still held secrets worth mapping. The development of sonar in the 1920s and 1930s was driven by submarine warfare, but also by a desire to understand the seafloor. The Cyclops tragedy symbolized the unknown. Every missing wreck reminded scientists that maps of the deep were blank. Today, oceanographic institutes continue to use the case in lectures. It illustrates how much of the ocean remains unexplored. Even with satellites and deep-sea drones, large objects can vanish, hidden under miles of shifting sediment.
In the mid-20th century, as the Bermuda Triangle myth gained traction, Cyclops became its crown jewel. Authors used it as proof that forces beyond science haunted the Atlantic. They tied it to alien abductions, time warps, and curses. Television shows replayed the story with ominous tones, often dropping historical accuracy in favor of spectacle. For families of the lost, this sensationalism was painful. Their fathers and grandfathers became characters in ghost stories. The real tragedy blurred under layers of myth. Yet paradoxically, the Triangle myth also preserved memory. Without it, the world might have forgotten the name Cyclops. Instead, the ship's fate remained part of public conversation, even if distorted.
Novels, films, and documentaries borrowed elements of the Cyclops mystery, sometimes directly, sometimes disguised. A ship vanishing without wreckage became a trope in science fiction and thrillers. Radio dramas in the 1940s referenced it. Comic books in the 1960s reimagined it. Hollywood in the 1970s nodded to it. Even video games in the 21st century placed echoes of Cyclops into their narratives. In this way, the ship sailed on in imagination, long after it sank in reality.
Amid the noise, historians tried to bring the focus back to the crew. Descendants of sailors organized small groups to share family archives. In Maryland, a few families collected photographs, letters, and keepsakes. They formed a patchwork memorial. Online forums expanded this effort, with strangers helping trace ancestry. Through these efforts, the men lost on Cyclops slowly regained names, faces, and stories. Even after a century, no wreckage has been definitively identified. Search expeditions in the Caribbean and Atlantic have scanned vast areas, but steel hides under sediment or lies in trenches beyond reach. Each time technology advances, hope rises. Perhaps one day sonar or submersibles will reveal the grave. Perhaps rusted beams still rest, silent under pressure. Until then, Cyclops remains both a historical fact
and a cultural myth. It occupies the rare space between documented tragedy and unsolved mystery.
Why was there no distress call? Did the cargo shift? Did structural flaws doom the vessel? Or did wartime espionage play a role? Each theory carries weight, none carry certainty. That tension sustains the mystery. Scholars dissect records, engineers model scenarios, writers spin tales, and families wait for closure. A century has passed, but the silence remains louder than answers.
The fate of Cyclops is not an isolated tale. Across centuries, the oceans have swallowed vessels whole, leaving no trace. By examining these parallels, we see patterns, recurring risks of war, technology, and nature. Each disappearance illuminates the fragility of human ambition against the sea.
The Great War produced other unexplained vanishings. In 1917, the British collier Camberwell disappeared off the English coast after leaving Newcastle. No wreckage, no survivors. Its cargo? Coal, a mundane mission that ended in silence. The American merchant vessel William Rockefeller was reported missing in 1918, during the same stormy season that claimed Cyclops. German U-boat records did not claim responsibility. The ocean kept its secrets. These cases remind us that wartime chaos often hid maritime tragedies. Mines, torpedoes, storms, and structural weaknesses could all erase a ship. Records, censored or lost, deepened the mystery.
2 decades after Cyclops, her sister ships repeated the story. USS Proteus vanished in 1941 en route from St. Thomas to Nova Scotia, carrying bauxite ore. USS Nereus disappeared the same year, on the same route, with the same cargo. Both left no wreckage. Both carried crews who vanished without farewell. The parallels are chilling. 3 ships, same design, same mission profile, same fate. It pointed toward a structural flaw or cargo instability, yet definitive proof never surfaced. These losses confirmed that Cyclops was not alone. The curse, if one may call it that, seemed to stalk the class of colliers.
In 1963, the tanker Marine Sulphur Queen vanished in the Gulf of Mexico with 39 men aboard. Her cargo? Molten sulfur. Investigators suspected structural cracks or explosion. No bodies, no wreckage sufficient to explain. This mirrored the Cyclops mystery decades later. A bulk cargo, hazardous to stability, carried by a ship not designed for safety redundancies. Once again, the ocean erased evidence.
Centuries earlier, fleets disappeared without explanation. The Spanish treasure galleons of 1715 were lost in hurricanes, their wreckage found only centuries later. The HMS Eurydice, a British training ship, capsized in 1878 near the Isle of Wight. Hundreds drowned, and for decades its ghost was reported by sailors. Though storms or human error caused many of these, the lack of closure shaped them into legends. Like Cyclops, they crossed the line from history into folklore. 2 decades after Cyclops, her sister ships repeated the story. USS Proteus vanished in 1941 en route from St. Thomas to Nova Scotia, carrying bauxite ore. From these cases, certain themes emerge. Bulk cargo instability, ore, coal, sulfur, dense and shifting loads often preceded disaster. Poor communication. Before satellite radios, distress calls were limited. A sudden catastrophe left no time. Censorship and war secrecy. In wartime, navies suppressed details, leaving families with rumors instead of facts. Geographic concentration. Many vanishings clustered in the Caribbean and North Atlantic, areas of unpredictable weather and treacherous seas.
For sailors, knowledge of these patterns seeded dread. Oral traditions aboard ships spoke of cursed routes and unlucky cargo. Skeptical officers dismissed superstition, but crews knew. They watched the sky and the sea with suspicion, sensing unseen dangers. The Cyclops' loss did not just haunt history. It haunted every sailor who later sailed her route. Each mystery forced innovation. The Navy adopted stricter stability calculations. Naval architects redesigned holds. Civilian regulators followed, requiring stronger hulls and communication systems. Paradoxically, every disappearance improved maritime safety. The silence of the lost became lessons carved into steel and law. When the Cyclops failed to arrive in Baltimore, the U.S. Navy convened inquiries.
Officers, engineers, and dock workers who last saw the ship testified. Reports emphasized 3 facts. The ship carried a heavy load of manganese ore. She departed Barbados with no distress in crew morale. The captain, George W. Worley, was considered erratic, even unstable. The inquiry concluded, probably lost due to unknown causes. It was as close as the Navy came to an admission of ignorance.
Worley's leadership drew suspicion. Born Johann Friedrich Wichmann in Germany, he immigrated to America and later naturalized. During wartime, his origins became ammunition for rumor. Witnesses described him as temperamental, prone to tirades, and deeply unpopular with his men. Some accounts suggested mutiny was possible. Propaganda outlets seized on this. Newspapers hinted that Cyclops might have been betrayed, handed to Germany, yet no evidence supported the claim. Worley's record, though blemished by temperament, showed loyalty to the United States.
The most popular wartime suspicion was a German submarine attack. German U-boats operated aggressively in the Atlantic in 1918. They sank hundreds of merchant vessels, often without warning. Yet no U-boat commander claimed credit for Cyclops. Post-war archives opened by Germany contained no reference to her. The silence is telling. In a war where each kill was propaganda, the disappearance of such a large vessel would have been trumpeted.
Manganese ore, dense and poorly distributed, posed real risk. If improperly trimmed in the hold, it could shift suddenly, destabilizing the vessel. Modern engineers reviewing records suggest that Cyclops might have suffered a catastrophic list, capsizing without warning. This would explain the absence of distress calls. A sudden roll, followed by a plunge, would leave no time. This theory gained weight when her sister ships, Proteus and Nereus, both carrying similar cargoes, vanished under similar conditions in 1941.
The Collier class had known weaknesses. Heavy loads strained their long hulls. If caught in a storm, midsection cracks could compromise integrity. Rumors circulated that Cyclops had suffered engine trouble before departure. Some dock workers in Barbados claimed her starboard engine was disabled. If true, she sailed handicapped. Combined with overload, her ability to withstand heavy seas diminished sharply.
Meteorological data for March 1918 shows squalls in the Caribbean and turbulent weather in the Atlantic. Though no hurricane was reported, sudden gales and rogue waves could easily overwhelm a weakened ship. Historical weather analysis later suggested a cold front collision near her route. If struck broadside, Cyclops may have rolled fatally.
In wartime, sabotage was never far from imagination. Some believed German agents infiltrated Caribbean ports. If Cyclops carried strategic manganese for steelmaking, she was a tempting target. The sabotage theory rested on circumstantial hints, Worley's German heritage, vague reports of discontent to board, and the valuable cargo. Yet again, no concrete proof. Without wreckage, sabotage remains conjecture.
Though not coined until the 1950s, later writers folded Cyclops into the Bermuda Triangle mythos. Her disappearance fit the template: sudden loss, no distress, no wreckage. While wartime realities offered rational explanations, the cultural appetite for mystery elevated her to legend. For the public, she became one of the Triangle's earliest victims.
In 1919, the Navy declared all 306 crew dead. The report closed the case administratively. Families received compensation. Widows mourned in silence. Yet for the public, the closure brought no satisfaction. The absence of a cause left room for folklore. Historians and engineers in later decades revisited the case. A 1929 naval engineering study concluded instability from cargo distribution was most probable. A 1968 Coast Guard review cited no conclusive evidence but structural failure plausible. In the 2000s, researchers at maritime institutes revisited archived testimonies, aligning with theories of overloading combined with weather stress. Each academic effort edged closer to rational explanation, but none erased the aura of mystery. During the war, the disappearance was weaponized. American newspapers accused Germany. German media mocked U.S. naval incompetence. This propaganda battle ensured the truth was obscured. Real investigation was hampered by the need to maintain morale. Families were told little. Speculation filled the void.
When World War I ended in November 1918, victory drowned many questions. The United States turned its eyes to peace,
demobilization, and the political battles of Versailles. Families of Cyclops sailors received official word: presumed lost at sea. For most, this was all they ever got. No grave, no body, no relic. Only silence. This silence grew heavier with time. While other wartime tragedies had memorials and battle records, Cyclops lingered in a strange limbo, unexplained, unresolved.
Behind statistics were families broken by absence. Letters home suddenly stopped. Mothers received cold telegrams. Wives dressed in black. Children grew up never knowing what truly happened to their fathers. Archival letters showed desperate appeals to the Navy. Please tell me if my boy suffered. Was it storm or enemy? Responses were formal, standardized. They gave nothing away. Grief turned into rumor. In coastal towns, whispers claimed Cyclops might yet return. Some believed sailors lived on a hidden island, captured or shipwrecked. Hope delayed closure. Despite the scale, 306 lives lost, the Cyclops never became a central story in naval history. Why? Partly because she was not lost in battle. No heroic fight, no recorded enemy. Her end produced no rallying cry. Instead, it was bureaucratic. Lost at sea, cause unknown. War memorials listed the names, but the story faded. By the 1930s, only maritime specialists remembered her.
When sister ships Proteus and Nereus vanished in 1941, echoes of Cyclops returned. Once again, colliers carrying heavy ore disappeared without trace. This time, families and journalists drew comparisons. Was the collier's design fatally flawed? Did cargo distribution doom them all? The Navy investigated, but wartime censorship limited public discussion. Still, the Cyclops story resurfaced briefly in press articles, framed as part of a larger pattern. In the 1950s and 1960s, popular writers transformed scattered maritime losses into one grand mystery: the Bermuda Triangle. Vincent Gaddis, Charles Berlitz, and others wove Cyclops into this narrative. In their books, the disappearance symbolized supernatural forces. Space-time warps, alien abductions, energy vortices, each theory found readers. Though historians criticized these ideas as sensational, the public loved them. The Triangle became a cultural phenomenon, and Cyclops, once a forgotten WW-1 supply ship, became legendary. Since the 2000s, marine archaeology has grown more ambitious. Side-scan sonar and remotely operated vehicles scan ocean floors once unreachable. Projects by the U.S. Navy and independent researchers have mapped stretches of the Atlantic where Cyclops may rest, yet so far, no confirmed wreck. Challenges are immense. The Atlantic is vast, with depths exceeding 3,000 meters. Records of Cyclops' last course are vague. Wreckage could be buried by sediment or broken beyond recognition. Still, hope persists. Each sonar anomaly stirs interest. Some researchers believe discovery is only a matter of time.
Naval architects continue to analyze the collier design. Simulations suggest that overloading manganese ore created instability thresholds far lower than safe standards. Combined with possible engine trouble and heavy seas, the ship could have been doomed from the moment she left Barbados. If ever found, the wreck may confirm this. Cracked hull, cargo shifted, catastrophic roll.
Cyclops lives on not in steel, but in imagination. She has appeared in novels, as a ghost ship swallowed by the sea, documentaries, as a case study in the Bermuda Triangle, online forums, as a magnet for speculation. Her story reflects our fascination with absence. A giant ship, hundreds aboard, vanished without trace. The human mind struggles with such voids, and so fills them with theories, myths, even supernatural tales.
3 elements explain her lasting grip. No wreckage. Unlike Titanic or Lusitania, there is no site, no grave. Large scale. Over 300 souls vanished. Too many to ignore. Historical timing. Amid global war, her loss blended into chaos, leaving questions unanswered. Together, these ensured she would not be forgotten.
In recent years, historians and naval organizations have renewed efforts to honor the crew. Digital archives now list their names. Memorials in Annapolis and Washington include them among WW-1 dead. Descendants gather occasionally to remember. For them, the mystery is less important than acknowledgement. Their fathers and grandfathers served and were lost. That service deserves respect.